So, one of the things I've been meaning to mention for a couple of classes now, but I keep forgetting, is we should mention Muhammad and Islam as another religion of the book. We talked about Judaism briefly, and then Christianity fairly briefly, although a little longer, of course, because we were looking at St. Augustine. And tonight we'll be looking at Anselm, St. Anselm, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, part of his life, but some other of the medieval philosophers as well that I think are at least good to know by name and the kinds of things that they did. But Muhammad, of course, from 570, 632 AD, CE, is, I think, fairly famous. I don't know if any members of the class are Islamic or Muslim or whatever. However, Islam, of course, was a very significant development, roughly by 650 AD, and continued on to have quite an impact. The areas that had been Christian around the Mediterranean were taken over, became dominated by Islamic powers. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire, I suppose, would be the largest extent, although by then the wars between the Moors, which were one of the elements of the Muslim countries at the time, was beaten by El Cid, if you're familiar with that at all. So Spain basically had been occupied, quite a lot of Spain had been occupied by a Muslim power, the Moors, and El Cid was the one that chased the Moors out eventually. The impact on Spain, of course, is pretty significant. The architecture is still, of course, some of the more famous sites in Spain, if you get to visit them, are Muslim architecture. Easy to tell the Islamic faith requires no icons, the same as the Protestants in Northern Europe. So the idea there is that icons that are images of specific individuals is understood to be banned by the scripture, and so you're not supposed to have graven images and things of that sort, idols, like statues and things of that sort. So the Protestant Reformation did away with a lot of that in the churches in Europe. They called them iconoclasts, which means they destroy icons. Right? But that was also a similarity they had with Islam, and so oddly, there was kind of a merger of interests between the Ottoman Empire and the Protestant Northern European sects. They mutually respected one another and were against the Catholics. So that's kind of interesting. Several times Europe was almost completely overrun. Seems to me both of the major events occurred around Vienna. The one was the siege of Vienna that was about the same time as Martin Luther, but that was broken up, and even though a lot of Eastern Europe became Muslim, by the way, that precipitated the issues once the communists were overthrown after around 1989. You ended up with the war, what we call it a war, I suppose, in Bosnia, and you know, we were even involved in that. Remember the missiles we dropped accidentally on the Chinese embassy? That's kind of embarrassing, I suppose, if you remember. But we bombed the Serbs in Serbo-Croatia. And by the way, I believe some of their generals are still on trial for the ethnic cleansing that went on during that period. And the reason for it was because it's a fight between the Christians and the Muslims in those countries, right? And those were established because the Ottoman Empire was there, and that was a Muslim power, right? So, and by the way, the reason I have this video up as a interesting link for you if you're curious. This is Douglas Murray, the author of a book called The Death of Europe, where he's talking about the culture of Europe being changed because of the migration of Muslims into Europe, and suspected eventual dominance of Muslim inhabitants in Europe. So the argument is that that's essentially going to be the death of the cultural Europe. Obviously, Europe's still going to be there. There will still be Europeans, obviously, inhabitants and so on, but the culture will change from one of a Christian culture, now really not Christian anymore, really it's more of a strictly non-partisan, what would you call it? Secular, I suppose. Secular is an odd word. Secular really came from the medieval use as a comparison between monks who were part of an order like the Franciscans and Augustinians and Jesuits and Dominicans and Benedictines and Cistercians. Those were all members of orders. But if you were a priest, say in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, the seminary of St. Charles Borromeo is a seminary where you can go and you become a priest, but you're not a member of an order. You're instead referred to as a secular. And the idea is that your job is primarily to be a pastor in a church, and you're not a member of a monastery, etc., right? So secular originally was with respect to particular types of priests, right? But today, and literally what it means is right now, right? So like second, right? Second is right now. And the other monks were concerned with eternity, right? So they were concerned with all eternity and basically dedicating their lives and living in the monasteries and praying to God and focusing on eternity, right? Whereas the secular priests were primarily concerned about the here and now of everyday life with the parishioners and helping them deal with life, etc., right? So that's where that came from. But when we think today in terms of secular culture, we think of a culture that is not, at least officially, based on a religion. And in a sense, it's false to think of it that way. But basically, if you go to France today and you visit one of the cathedrals like Notre Dame, if they repair it, they're repairing it, right? You know it caught fire not too long ago. They're repairing it. But any of those sites, if you go visit those, what you see are tourists getting tours all around. Even on a Sunday, there's very, very few people that are actually there to hear Mass or to pray. And usually they're older people. And it's more of a rural community. if you're in Paris, it's just a very small little section up right around the central altar where they actually have a mass on Sundays. But even so, while that's going on, there's hundreds of tourists milling about with tour guides explaining things in the cathedral. So basically those sites, even though they're supported by taxes in places like France and Germany, I think you can opt out if you want. But basically they're supported primarily for tourism, to attract tourists to come to look at those kinds of sites and so on, but they're no longer really functioning as a religious institution. The Missa Solemnis was in the cloister of Ebersbach, and notice you can rent the place for parties. They've got lots of different venues in the cloister. You know, you can have weddings there. You can have, you know, all sorts of events like that concert that I was just playing briefly, and so on. That's no longer a cloister. There's no Cistercian monks living there anymore. So it's kind of dying out, right? So you might say that, well, if Europe was a Christian culture, that's actually changed. It's more of a secular culture now. Where we could see a big difference would be, say, in the United States, where most people, at least roughly 60-some%, say that they're still theists or they believe in God. Of course, the issue with a lot of American believers, however you want to call it, refer to them, is that American religions tend to be very different than European ones. Instead of high Protestant sects like Lutheran and High Church Episcopal in England, they're usually Baptist. Well, we do have what we call mainline churches, which are the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Lutherans. By the way, the Lutherans have merged with the Episcopalians now in the United States. It's official, because both churches were declining, and so they merged. So the high churches, like the Roman Catholic Church, but not the Roman Catholic Church, have been declining in the United States. The churches that are growing are the Roman Catholic Church and Baptist and Latter-day Saints. And
how did that happen?
How did that happen?
Yeah, how did that merger happen?
How did the merger happen? Lots of discussions between elements of both churches where they discussed and realized that they had lots of things in common, and so they ended up, so priests can go to both churches now, etc.
Huh.
You could look it up. I'm sure it's quite complex, but nonetheless, I know it happened not too long ago, actually. However, when we look at Douglas Murray, he's convinced that still the culture, the secular culture of Europe is going to disappear, and it's eventually going to become Islamic because of migration, and it's explained really by this guy. That's why I posted this. This are the note. These are the notes I posted in Blackboard for class tonight, and one of the individuals is Tariq Ramadan, and he is, as you can see, he's a professor of contemporary Islamic studies at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, right? And in his books, he writes to the Muslims that have been migrating to Europe. He's written for years, and he explains to them how they can live as members of the Islamic faith in secular Europe, right? And his explanations to them is to blend in, to accept the way Europeans do things and live accommodating those cultural differences, despite the fact that a lot of the things that cultural Europeans do are haram or evil as far as the Islamic religion is concerned, like eating pork, women going about without being covered. Notice, of course, there was the issue at several different occasions where women at festivals were attacked, gangs would attack them in public. And it was pretty clear, even though if you read about it, the press does try to cover it up because they're trying to avoid precisely the kind of event that happened just the other day, where a couple of individuals who were trying to get rid of as many non-Europeans as they could attacked a couple of hashish bars. Did you read that? Anybody? That just happened the other day. I don't know how to spell hashish. Well, in any case, 9 people were killed, and the 9 people were residents, but not the recent migrants, right? So extremists are trying to kill people that have migrated to Europe from other places. So they're trying to avoid exactly this kind of response by native Germans, Hungarians, things of that sort. Certainly a problem, but at the same time, there are cultural clashes that are severely damaging the relationships between the migrants and the people that have lived there culturally for generations. It's very complex, but so interesting question. Douglas Murray seems to think that it's almost guaranteed that eventually Europe will become Islamic. So, Tariq Ramadan, he recommends migrating Muslims into Europe to acclimate to the European culture and just bide their time, follow their Islamic traditions within their families, within their communities, have lots of children, and eventually the population will become a majority Islamic, and then they can use the vote to basically turn the country legitimately into an Islamic society. So England is doing the same kind of thing. London, if you've heard, is predominantly now migrants that are not Episcopal Church of England. So it's becoming, the mayor of London right now is Khan something. Sadiq Khan. Brilliant guy, by the way. So, but what is the difference between Judaism or Judaism and Christianity and Islam? Islam, Muhammad argued that Islam is the correct religion reinstalled, so to speak, based on the original Abraham tradition, with the difference from the Jewish sect in that the Jewish sect is primarily concerned with an ethnic group. So we get into the question of whether or not Judaism is a religion or an ethnicity, and it's obviously kind of a mixture of both. You can convert to Judaism, but I also know a lot of people who think of themselves as Jewish, even though they don't practice the religion. They think of themselves as Jewish because of their genetic inheritance, right? So it's very interesting. It's, by the way, a legitimate political issue because Israel wants to be considered a Jewish state as opposed to a state where a lot of Jews have migrated to. Does that make sense? There's a difference between that. And that could be significant because if it's a Jewish state, then by definition, it's not a modern state, because modern states are secular, officially secular, right? Like the United States, for example, when President Trump said, okay, we're not going to accept people from these countries coming in because they're Islamic. Whoa, you can't do that because that's separation of church and state clause, right? And so you're basically saying you have to be a member of appropriate religions in order to come into the United States. So they had to finagle that. It went back and forth about 5 or 6 times before the court finally agreed that the people that he was trying to keep from coming in were not allowed to come in. And it wasn't because they were Islamic anymore, but it was instead because of the danger of terrorism in that country, right? So that was legitimate, right? That was legitimate, and that was really what I think President Trump was trying to prevent in the first place. Maybe, who knows? But eventually, legally, I guess that actually got arranged that way. The critique that Islamists have for Christianity is that Christianity is not actually a monotheistic religion because it has 3 persons in one God. So it has the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which makes it 3, not 1. So typically when they talk about the Islamic religion, they point out that there's no God but God, just Allah, right? In fact, that's the title of a book by Reza Aslan. Reza Aslan is quite prolific. I like the word prolific today. So prolific. He's written a lot. Zealot. One of them was how to win a war of terrorism. I forget. Or how to win a religious war is one of his books. Okay. So, another individual that I meant to cover and haven't yet, let me quick do that, is Moses Maimonides. Uh-oh, this might not be a good link. No, it should be. Okay, so Moses Maimonides, which is the Latinized version. Another way of saying it is Ben Maimon, Ben meaning son of Maimon. Moses is his name. And he was originally from Spain, and when El Cid kicked the Moors out of Spain, the Christians insisted that everyone in Spain had to become a Christian. So if you were Jewish, you had to convert or die, basically. I believe that was the choice they were given. It turned out that even those who said, okay, I convert, and they were converted, but they were still under suspicion. So the Grand Inquisition, of course, was an issue, always checking to make sure that they really were, had given up their Jewish practices and so on. But the family of Moses ben Maimon left Spain as a result of their being kicked out of Spain, basically. And eventually Moses ben Maimon ended up in Egypt, where he, as a Jewish scholar and a physician, ended up becoming the court physician for Saladin, who was the Sultan. If I don't think he's called the Sultan, but everyone after him was called the Sultan. So he was the advisor to Saladin. So if you think about it, Islam was traditionally, in this sense, thought of as a more moderate religion, in the sense that they accepted Jewish people to live with them, they accepted Christians to live with them, but they did have restrictions on them. You had to pay extra taxes, for example, and you would literally have to live in a particular neighborhood, and you had to be in that neighborhood by nightfall, or you could be arrested, etc. And that, by the way, is the origination of the neighborhood technique that the Nazis used in Poland and other places as well. So that was originally an Islamic technique to handle Jewish people, was to keep them in a particular neighborhood. But the reason Moses ben Maimon is so important is many people consider him to have been the greatest Jewish philosopher that ever lived. There's an interesting expression. From Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. That's kind of a fun one to remember, I guess. And of course, what they're talking about is Moses, the traditional author of the first 5 books of the Bible. That Moses, Moshe, the one that led them out of Egypt, right? So from Moses, that Moses, to this Moses, there was no one like Moses. So he's really considered quite significant. And what did he do? Well, he was an Aristotelian. So as a scholar, he became aware of Aristotle's works in Arabic and made them available not only to the Jewish community, but also to the Christian community. And in working with that text, realizing that the Platonic nature of Jewish beliefs, and by the way, Christian beliefs, were being ruined by Aristotle's critiques, right? And we kind of went over that. Here's one of the reasons we did, right? Plato gives us the ideals, or the ideas and matter, But Aristotle says ideas don't exist, you just have substance, and forms or ideas are part of the shape that things take, etc., the definition of the thing. But the definition doesn't exist apart from in words, right? It's not like there's some horseness that exists somewhere in the universe, right? Instead, you only have horses. You have individuals, but thanks to language, we could talk about universals as characteristics of sets of existing things, right? But you don't actually have abstract, invisible, existing whatever. That doesn't happen. As a result, the religion had to change, both Christianity and Judaism, because both of them were Platonic up until that point, right? So Moses ben Maimon is the one who basically reinterprets Jewish religion in league or in in order to accept Aristotle's philosophy, which is a much more scientifically progressive way of understanding the universe, right? In order to accommodate the Jewish religion, he also wrote a book called The Guide to the Perplexed, which, let me get back to, where did I put that? Shoot. I lost what I had. Oh, there it is. Sorry. So The Guide to the Perplexed. Could have found it faster just using Google. I still can't find it. Where did I put it? Here it is. So The Guide for the Perplexed. Basically, the idea is people in reading Aristotle and having been raised believing in the Jewish religion or the Christian religion are going to be perplexed. And the reason is it's going to appear that many of their religious beliefs are untenable. They're in contradiction to the way the philosophy explains the way the universe is, right? So what do you do in that case? So his guide for the perplexed primarily says, as a guide, don't teach people that have no need of Aristotle's philosophy. In other words, leave them believing their religion like children, they're perfectly fine that way. If you think about it, that's still the way a lot of folks recommend things be dealt with. I know an interesting book on this subject is by Daniel Dennett, and it's called Trapped, I think, in the Pulpit. Caught in the Pulpit. So this is Daniel Dennett, who's a contemporary philosopher. I guess he's about 70-something. And he interviews priests and ministers, I think even a few rabbis, and the questions he has for them is, okay, so typically you start off as a young man, usually going to seminary, believing firmly in the religion that you grew up as a kid believing, and you get to the seminary and you become a minister in your particular sect or religion, and then you get to your first or second churches where you're giving sermons and so on. Meanwhile, you do a lot of study on your own in order to improve your sermons and so on, and out of curiosity, you're educating yourself. And as you do this, you end up discovering things that you realize mean you have to change your beliefs, that a lot of your younger beliefs are incompatible with the new things you're learning. And then you're caught in the pulpit, right? Because this is your career. You might have a family, you might have a 401k, you know, all the issues, right? But your job is to basically preach something that you no longer believe is true. So what do? Continue doing that? Well, if you do, of course, you're going to feel guilty because you feel like you're lying to people, right? On the other hand, a lot of the ministers would begin teaching the things that they've learned, even though they're contrary to a lot of the things that their faith requires them to promote, and they end up with trouble in the parish because the people don't want to hear this stuff. Right? A lot of them will come up and say, don't be teaching us that. Let's just stick with, if it's good enough for Moses, it's good, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. That kind of, right? So you get the idea. There's a lot of people that are caught in the pulpit. What do they do, and how do they handle that situation? And of course, a lot of them have actually left their positions, which is difficult because, of course, it means giving up your career, basically. One of the things that some do is they move from one religion to another. So there's actually kind of a chain of religions. I think I think I did that at one point where we have like the Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists and LDS, but then as you go, you can move into like the Methodists, low church Methodists, high church Methodists, which would bring you up this way, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Unitarian Universalists, and then atheists. In fact, when you talk to Unitarian Universalists, I'm not plugging the Anchorage Unitarian Universalists, although I happen to be a member, have been since '95, was president one year, but that's not a plug. I'm just saying, right? Kind of like, parenthetical statement. By the way, Bezos owns this paper, that kind of thing. Sorry, I always laugh whenever I see that. It's always a non sequitur. Oh, by the way, and Bezos owns the owner of Amazon. Sorry. But by the time you get to the Unitarian Universalist position, their principles are basically broad enough that dolphins are Unitarians. Dolphins, the mammals that look like fish.
Yeah.
Elephants too, by the way.
What is the standard? I'm completely ignorant of this.
Okay. Well, we can do it.
I'm totally on board, but
So I'm still not advertising, just so you know. Where did they hide the principles now? They keep changing the... Shoot. I don't see where the principles went. I lost them. Here they are. Aha. Okay, so these are the 7 principles. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. If you change that to dolphin, notice dolphins certainly accept that, I would think. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. That's incredibly ambiguous.
yeah.
Dolphins easily would agree with that. Acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregation. Still no problem. Right? A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. I'm sure the Dolphins are democratic, not the football team. You knew I meant the fish, the mammals,
Yeah.
not the football team. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So, it seems to me the Dolphins are UUs, right? Pretty easy. Notice the word God is not mentioned in any of those, and so I absolutely know that a large number of the Anchorage UUs are atheists. Okay, that's just fine. So if you're taking them on, remember my cognitive map where I have certitude or certainty on the top and uncertainty on the bottom. If you think of the dogma of these various sects, Christian sects, notice that they become more and more ambiguous, open to ambiguity, right? So you have more certitude if you're, say, a fundamentalist, right? That's what fundamentalism means, right? That way. Okay. So Moses ben Naaman, very significant. Another one that had been mentioned in various places that I'd never covered was Boethius. He's also referred to as the last Roman. Notice we're going back. This is about the same time as Augustine. But the reason Boethius is significant is, and he's called the last Roman, I don't know why that would be. It's just something, a meme associated with Boethius. But he translated some of Aristotle's logical works into Latin. Those were the significant, and by the way, a lot of that he did in prison because the emperor threw him into prison because he was a follower of Athanasius, and the emperor at the time was a follower of Arius and didn't trust Boethius. So he threw him into prison, and over the course of a year or so, had him tortured and eventually executed.
Who are those two?
Boethius?
No, the people they were following, the different.
Ah, you missed
Oh,
that. We
okay.
actually
I missed that.
discussed that in class. Athanasius was the one that won and is officially considered orthodox, and Arius was the Gnostic that lost. So, but check one of the video. I think I got it pretty good.
All
So
right.
check that, and you'll see lots of good stuff on that. So Boethius, I meant to get back to him because I saw that go by and we missed it. Okay. But the one we really need to look at tonight is Anselm. This is the text that I linked to that I hoped you'd have a chance to read some. And where I want to pick up is right here. Chapter 2. Is it big enough for you to see in the back? Yes? Okay. So, some of the important things, I should mention Anselm, at the time he wrote this, was probably the abbot of the monastery at Bec, B-E-C, in Normandy. he would eventually become the Archbishop of Canterbury. As far as I know, didn't have much time to write once he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. This was about the time where William the Conqueror had, remember William the Conqueror was a Norman duke that wanted to expand his territory by attacking England, and ended up, of course, conquering England, but it took most of his life, and he never really stopped fighting the whole time. And the people that were there, mostly Saxons, were primarily the enemy, but the church was already there. It was already a Christian nation, and the church was concerned that this violent conflict between the Normans taking over and the Saxons that were already there did not do too much damage, not only to the people but also to the church. And so they were trying to basically have some control over what the Normans were doing. The first bishop of, or Archbishop of Canterbury, which was like not quite but almost, there was also an Archbishop, I think, of York, and they weren't, today, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head Archbishop of the Church of England under the Queen, right? The Queen is the head of the English Church today. Yes? No? They had a Reformation thanks to Henry VIII. If you remember, Henry VIII had married Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess. Didn't really produce an heir that he was happy with, so he wanted to divorce her and marry another, Anne of Boleyn, or Anne Boleyn. You remember Anne of 1,000 Days. Catherine of Aragon didn't want to have a divorce. She obviously wanted her daughter to become the queen. Plus, the King of France, or rather the King of Spain, was quite upset that his daughter was being divorced, etc., right? So they went to the Pope to deny his appeal for a divorce. And the Pope was actually surrounded by the Spanish forces at the time, so he sided with the Spanish. So King Henry couldn't have a divorce, and so he decided, well, if that's the case, then I'll take my church and leave the Catholic Church, and so he created the Church of England. There's a interesting explanation of all this by a British comedian